Does the administration really have the ability to do that as well right now?
Well, again, it wouldn't be a military thing. I think it would be essentially collaborative or cooperative to a large extent. It would involve economic tools, a lot of diplomacy. I don't think it would be in conflict, if you will, or excuse me, it wouldn't be impossible to do this. Whatever we choose to do in Iran, whether we continue militarily, find a way to end things, I don't see the things essentially fighting over the same resources.
All right, let's talk about Iran. Stephen, I just read a number of the headlines. None of them are good. Donald Trump appears to be wading into a quagmire here, and we use quagmire intentionally. What are the options right now?
Well, the failure to secure the Strait of Hormuz right away at the opening of this conflict is a big mystery of this war. I think that the president believed the shock and awe, to refer to another war in the Middle East, he believed that that would lead to the crumbling of the regime very, very quickly. So there wasn't a lot in this plan, apparently, in order to do something that the regime had threatened to do over many years, which is to, if Iran was attacked and the regime threatened that the Iranians would close the strait. So now we're confronted with a situation where we're trying to crack it open militarily, and it's going to take weeks to do that kind of thing. The attack on Karg Island was a suggestion that perhaps the president wanted to hold Iran's own oil resources hostage. But of course, he's the one who has campaigned on low gas prices for Americans. He doesn't want to tank the economy that he has been touting, whether it's true or not that he's been wonderful for the American economy or not. To blockade Iran's oil would do more damage to American consumers.
How does the United States get out of this? I mean, the reporting that we've seen is that the regime is now more entrenched and potentially much more hardline than even the past Ayatollah, that his son is actually much more extreme. So if part of it was regime change or just even never allowing them to have a nuke again, how does the administration untangle themselves from this war? Or in order to reach the goal of never allowing them to have a nuke, are they going to be forced, Stephen, to send in ground troops to try to seize the enriched uranium, to try to do what it can to make sure that the ability to produce a weapon is no longer in the hands of the Iranians?
Well, Katie, there's a reason why previous presidents confronted with this problem chose not to do what President Trump has done, given the difficulties associated with regime change or whatever the other 7 objectives the president has laid out. I think he's given himself a fair amount of room for maneuver so that if regime change isn't in the offing, he can say that they have degraded the regime and changed its behavior. But what you're pointing to is the fact that should their regime change fail, or should the Islamic regime collapse, but some new, fiercer kind of dictatorship emerge, the logical thing for those leaders to do is to make a dash for a nuclear weapon, the ultimate source of regime security. So this is the kind of problem that the president has created for himself, where, again, if not successful here, we'll have to keep going back and going back and going back to try to contain the Iranians who would be, as I said, racing towards a nuclear weapon.
Which is a version of a forever war. It also shows, Richard, the disconnect between the American goals and the Israeli goals, because the Israelis have not deviated from the goal of regime change, and they're still saying it even today. Benjamin Netanyahu is saying it, and they're going out and they're still trying to kill as many of the regime's leaders as they can, and killing Laranjani today. Given the disconnect, what does that mean for this country? So even if Donald Trump wanted to get out tomorrow and made up a reason to say that he was successful and pulled out, could he, with the Israelis still on the move?
Katie, you're right. There's a divergence between Israeli and American war aims. It's probably all along, certainly at this point. And if we're interested ever in negotiating an agreement with some Iranian or rump Iranian government, continuing to kill people is not the way to go about it. We've already discredited negotiations by having twice launched wars against Iran in the midst of negotiations. That said, if the United States wants to end this, All it will take is a phone call from Donald Trump to Bibi Netanyahu. Think about it. Bibi Netanyahu has an election this year. His strongest calling card politically is that he has forged a close relationship with Donald Trump, better than any Israeli prime minister's ever had with any American president. I don't think he can afford to alienate Trump if Trump wants to end the war. And who is he going to appeal to in the United States? He could do an end run around Donald Trump to whom? The Democrats certainly aren't going to get closer to him. So actually, I think Donald Trump has enormous leverage here. He leaned on Bibi Netanyahu to accept the ceasefire in Gaza that brought the final Israeli hostages home. So that's the least of our problems. I think the real question is, can we find people in Iran willing and able to negotiate an end to this war on terms that both sides can live with? That's an infinitely more difficult and bigger question than working out anything with Bibi Netanyahu.
Yeah, and the leverage, that Iran has is the Strait of Hormuz. So if they're not getting a deal that they like, they can continue to choke off the strait, which they have been doing. And on that note, it's been affecting the global economy, the economy here at home. Gas prices are up. Let's play Kevin Hassett talking about that fact today.
But the fact is that the U.S. economy is fundamentally sound, and that if it were to be extended, it wouldn't really disrupt the U.S. economy very much at all. It would hurt consumers, and we'd have to think about, if that continued, what we would have to do about that. But that's like really the last of our concerns right now, because we're very confident that this thing is going ahead of schedule.
So they're not thinking about consumers. The last thing they're thinking about is consumers, not the greatest choice of words. And I'm sure that Kevin Hassett's probably regretting that today. But it does reveal something about the administration's thinking regarding this war, Justin.
Yeah, look, there's the difference here between macroeconomics and microeconomics. What Happy Kevin was just doing was doing macroeconomics, what happens to the country as a whole. And it's true that we basically produce as much oil as we need. So when the oil price goes up, on average, America is neither better nor worse off. The consumer's comment, though, is the heart of the matter, which is, how is it that you and I are paying more at the tank, yet the country as a whole is neither better nor worse off? And it's because this is a massive redistribution. High oil prices and therefore high gas prices are a big redistribution from customers, consumers, folks like you and I live in the Midwest, we have to drive everywhere, to those who benefit from selling oil, which is to say oil companies. So if you think that shifting hundreds of millions of dollars across to oil companies and out of the pockets of mums and dads is neutral, then you think there's nothing going on here. If you have a heart and you have a brain instead, you think this is actually going to be a big deal here.
Yeah. I want to go back to Cuba, because I guess I just am surprised, Richard, that you don't think the idea that of Cuba, us getting involved in Cuba right now while we're in the middle of a conflict in Iran, and there's so much. I just am surprised that you're not a little more skeptical of our ability to do anything easily there, to negotiate easily, to have an easy transitional government, to make life better. Explain why you're so much more assured than I am.
Because I don't think what we would do in Cuba would be all that ambitious or intrusive. That's why I think the Venezuela model is better than the Iran model. It would not be confrontational. We're not going to try to remake the country. It wouldn't require nation building. What I think we're looking at is something fairly modest. Again, we would have investment, tourism, and so forth. We'd avoid a massive flood of refugees. And, we wouldn't try to remake Cuba with American boots on the ground. Again, I think it would be pretty hands off, and I think it would be seen as moving Cuba in a better direction. Katie, can I come back just for what Kevin Hassett was saying?
Yeah, of course.
Just to take issue with two things about it. One is the idea that you could be so sanguine about the economy. It's also food prices because of fertilizer. We've got to trade with the rest of the world. See, the idea that the American economy can be this oasis in a world that's suffering big time because oil's at $100 or $150 a barrel is not the way the American economy works. We have trading partners and the rest. Also means American businesses are going to slow down making decisions because of all the uncertainty, almost like COVID slowed down a lot of things. Second of all, if the war continues, we shouldn't assume it necessarily continues in its current form. What happens if it escalates? What happens if a desperate Iran at some point moves against the oil facilities of a Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or a Kuwait or the UAE, much more than they've done so far? One of the things you learn in the Middle East is bad situations can always get worse. So I get nervous when administration officials say we're on schedule, ahead of schedule, things are working out just fine. I wouldn't believe that for a minute.
Justin, bounce off that.
Yeah, look, I love the fact Richard jumped into my economics lane. I'm going to go over and jump in his foreign affairs lane. And I want to try and explain, Katie, why it is you and he see the world a little differently. And I think there's really something important here. Richard's a much better foreign relations guy than I am, and he's used to moving the chess pieces around the board and all of that. And in a normal administration, the first thing I'd do is I'd call Richard Haas and ask him what he thought. What he left out of any of his comments was any mention of one word: competence. And the moment you have doubts about the competence of an administration to move the right chess piece, to move at the right time, then all of this goes apart. And so what I want to do is put his optimism about Cuba next to the reality of the trade war we just saw play out, a trade war in which it took the administration literally 11 months to realize that tariffs on bananas were not going to bring banana factories back to America, or the Iran invasion in which they forgot to get Americans out of the Middle East. They forgot to buy oil ahead of time. And as far as I can tell, it's one of the most incompetent invasions we've ever seen.